How can a continent so rich in diamonds have hospitals with no gloves? How can the soil that feeds the world let its own children go hungry? They say Africa is poor, but the truth, we are not poor. We are being drained. We are paying for our own chains. Every year we send billions in interest payments to the same institutions that promise to help. The World Bank, the IMF. They come with smiles and loans, but behind those contracts lie conditions, sharp, silent, and colonial. And yet, in the heart of Burkina Faso, something is shifting. A soldier with fire in his voice is rising. Ibrahim Traoré, not yet 40, but already saying what others feared to whisper, "We do not need permission to be free." This is not just a story of debt. This is a story of awakening. If you are ready to unlearn the lies and reclaim the truth, stay with me. And subscribe not just for this video, but for the dream of a free Africa. It began far from African soil. A cold room in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 1944. 44 nations gathered to rebuild a broken world after war. But not a single African voice was there, because Africa in their eyes was not a nation, it was a colony. They spoke of peace, of prosperity, of rebuilding, but they built their future on our silence. From that summit emerged two giants, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Dressed in the language of development and stability, they would go on to shape the lives of billions. But for Africa, their mission was never neutral. From the very beginning, the rules were written by the West. The money came from the West. The votes stayed in the West. And the power it never left. To this day, the president of the World Bank is always American. The head of the IMF, always European. And together, the G7 and EU control over 50% of the votes. Meanwhile, African nations rich in minerals, rich in spirit, barely whisper in the boardroom. They set the laws, we live the consequences. And here is the bitter truth, the system was never broken. It was built like this, to keep us here. Down, obedient, paying. They say loans are lifelines, but for us they became shackles. When a European country borrows from the World Bank, it pays little. But when Africa borrows, the interest doubles, sometimes triples. Why? Is it because our skin is darker, our lands poorer, or because we dare to survive without their blessing? In Burkina Faso, a nation rich with gold, children still learn under leaking roofs. Hospitals run out of gloves. Mothers walk 10 kilometers for clean water. And yet, millions are sent every year not to build, but to repay. They do not care how we live. They only care that we pay. And when we cannot, we borrow again, just to repay the last. This is not development. This is debt slavery refined and repackaged. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, they export $4 billion worth of cobalt every year. But their public health budget, only $38 million. Our minerals power the world, but our children die without antibiotics. They call this aid, we call it betrayal. So let me ask you, if your child lay dying in a hospital with no bandages, but your president had to send millions to Washington, what would you do? They wear suits. They speak of GDP. They shake hands at summits. But ask the people of Malawi, Kenya, Zambia, and you will hear a different truth. In Marrakesh, Morocco, something sacred happened. Not in the grand halls of IMF meetings, but just steps away, in a tent filled with voices the world forgot. The Global People's Tribunal, a courtroom for the voiceless. From Ecuador to Egypt, from Indonesia to Ivory Coast they came. Mothers, farmers, nurses, teachers, to speak what no statistic can measure. Their testimonies cracked the mask. They told of hospitals closed not by war, but by budget cuts. Of fuel subsidies slashed while foreign companies profited. Of schools with no chalk while consultants earned millions. And worst of all, they told of hunger, not from drought, but from policy. One woman from Sierra Leone whispered, "My son died digging for diamonds, but I could not afford his coffin." And still, her country pays interest, not to her, but to banks in Paris and New York. This is not assistance, this is collection. The IMF does not just lend, it enforces. It acts not for the people, but for the creditors. So the rich stay rich, and the poor stay silent. Until now. Task 5. Traore, Chang Trai, Noi Kong Kan, Phep. They said we needed patience. They said we needed structure. They said, wait. But in Burkina Faso, a soldier stopped waiting. He was not backed by a bank, not propped up by embassies. He did not wear expensive suits. He wore dust and determination. Ibrahim Traoré, a captain, a farmer's son, a man not yet 40, but already carrying the fire of Sankara in his chest. He stood before his people and said, "We will not ask for permission to exist." He ended French military presence. He kicked out Western media channels. And he began replanting the land, 20 million trees across Burkina Faso. No consultants, no foreign aid, just willpower and dignity. For decades they told us we were not ready. But Traoré proved readiness is not given, it is claimed. He is not perfect, no leader is. But he dared what many feared. To say no, to stand tall, to remember who we are. And now the world is watching. Because if Burkina Faso rises, what excuse will the others have? They called it development, but we saw our children die. They called it aid, but we watched our hospitals close. They called it stability, but all we felt was silence. For decades, Africa walked a road paved by others, a road marked with conditions, signed in languages we never spoke, measured in dollars, not dignity. And yet, we endured. But now something is stirring. In the villages of Mali, in the markets of Nairobi, in the fields of Burkina Faso, a whisper rising, a fire reborn, from the mothers who say, "I cannot bury another child for someone else's profit," to the youth who chant, "We are not leaving, we are rebuilding," and to the leaders rare, brave, flawed, but rising like Ibrahim Traoré, who do not beg but build. This is not a rebellion, it is a resurrection. Africa is not asking, Africa is declaring. No more charity with strings, no more loans laced with loss. No more waiting for permission to be whole, because we were whole long before we were colonized, and we will be whole again not with their systems but with our souls. So let the world hear this. We do not fear debt, we fear silence. We do not reject partnership, we reject control. And we do not want pity, we demand respect. This is the hour, the turning, the reclaiming, and it begins not in Washington but in every African heart that dares to say, "We are not victims, we are the future." If this truth lives in you, type it now in all caps, New Africa. Say it, write it, live it, and share this story. Not just because it matters, but because silence is no longer an option. They told us to be grateful. Grateful for aid, grateful for loans, grateful for a seat at the very back of a system we never built. But the truth, gratitude is not the same as freedom. For generations, Africa was taught to look outward, to the World Bank, to the IMF, to the capitals of old empires. They came dressed as saviors. They left with our minerals. They spoke of progress. We lived the consequences. This is the story of how two institutions built without us were used to control us. How loans became leashes. How interest became punishment. How the rules of a global game were never meant to let us win. But within this injustice lies a lesson. A truth too big to ignore. Africa is not poor, it is being drained, not just of money, but of sovereignty, of voice, of the right to decide. And the numbers are brutal. $40 billion lost each year through tax evasion by foreign companies. African nations paying double the interest of European countries for the same loans. A continent with the youngest population and the highest youth unemployment. Rich in gold, cobalt, uranium, but still begging for gloves and hospitals. It is not a lack of resources. It is the structure that steals them. And when the structure is built against you, survival itself becomes resistance. Which is why the lesson is not just about banks. It is about power and who gets to define the future. That is where Ibrahim Traoré enters. Not just as a man, but as a message. That we do not need permission to be free. That we do not have to apologize for reclaiming what was always ours. His leadership teaches us, sovereignty is not given. It is taken with courage, with conviction. He is not the only one, but he is a mirror, a reflection of the pain we endured and the fire we now carry. This story reminds us that the first step to freedom is to name the chains, and the second to break them. That breaking may look like protests, or policies, or simply saying no. No to debt that kills. No to aid that silences, no to systems that pretend to save us while draining our strength, because in the end the greatest lesson is this. Africa does not need pity, it needs truth. and truth spoken boldly becomes power. This is our hour, not because the West allows it, but because we are finally allowing ourselves to remember, to resist, to rebuild. From Marrakesh to Burkina Faso, from mothers who bury children to farmers who plant trees, where bombs once fell, the story is changing. The scam is exposed, the silence is broken, and Africa is waking up. So what now? Do we return to silence? To waiting rooms in Geneva, Washington and Brussels asking once again for crumbs? Or do we rise? This is not just a political question. It is personal. Because when your mother cannot find medicine, when your village has light but your bill goes to Paris, when your children are taught the history of their colonizers but not the names of their own heroes, that is not development, that is domination, and we must unlearn it. We must teach our children about Patrice Lumumba, about Thomas Sankara, about the day Ibrahim Traoré said, "We are not waiting, we are standing." We must build local schools that teach in our languages, support doctors who heal with both science and tradition, empower farmers to feed the continent, not the markets of Europe. We must look inwards, not because we reject the world, but because we must know who we are before we negotiate who we become. Africa's lesson is not just about broken banks. It is about healing a broken belief that freedom must be approved. No, freedom must be lived. And yes, the road is hard. Some leaders will stumble. Some systems will resist. But the people are learning. They are speaking. And most importantly, they are no longer ashamed to say, "We want sovereignty. We want dignity. We want more than survival. We want life. Real life, our life, African life on African terms." So to every brother in Chicago, every sister in Kingston, every elder in Lagos, every student in Dakar, let this be your lesson too. You are not powerless. You are not voiceless. You are not alone. Because the fight for Africa is not just on African soil. It is in every mind that refuses to accept this injustice as normal. So learn the lesson, teach the story, and when they ask you, what has Africa gained, you answer, clarity and a continent ready to reclaim itself. Because Africa is not just a place. Africa is a pulse. It beats in Harlem. It echoes in Brixton. It whispers through the back streets of Port-au-Prince. It dances in Bahia. It weeps in Haiti. It fights in Johannesburg. Africa is not only soil, it is soul. So when we speak of reclaiming Africa, we are not just speaking to those born on the continent. We are calling every child of the diaspora, every descendant of the stolen, every voice that has ever wondered why history always began with chains. You were never the aftermath. You were the continuation. You are not foreign, you are returned. And now we ask not for your sympathy, we ask for your solidarity. Because this time, the freedom we seek is not just freedom from colonizers. It is freedom from the belief that we need them. We are not waiting for rescue, we are writing the rescue. And whether you sit in Accra or Atlanta, in Nairobi or New Orleans, know this. You are a part of the story. You are a page in the prophecy. You are the drumbeat of the revival. Let them hear it. Let the world feel it. Let your children remember it. That there was a time when Africa stopped asking and started becoming, and it began not with governments, but with people who chose to believe we are enough. We are not poor, we are powerful. We are not silent, we are singing again. So rise, not just for yourself, but for the continent that still calls your name. Africa is not lost. Africa is not waiting. Africa is coming home. So what do we do with this truth? We act, not with rage alone, but with reason, not with begging, but with building, not with revenge, but with remembering. We fund our own schools. We support African farmers. We tell our stories, not theirs. We stop calling poverty a fate. We call it what it is: policy, imposed, engineered, enforced. We stop applauding crumbs. We demand justice. We stop romanticizing aid. We invest in self-reliance. We learn to say no, with clarity, with dignity, with strategy. And perhaps most powerfully, we teach the next generation that Africa was never weak. She was wounded, but wounds can heal, and scars can speak. And truth once spoken cannot be buried again. This is the mission, not to beg for change, but to be the change. To be the African parent who tells their child, "You were born with a name, a language, a history. You are not second, you are not less." To be the African youth who says, "I will not leave, I will build." To be the leader who does not ask for applause, but earns respect through action. Because the greatest scam of the century is not just economic. It is emotional, it is spiritual. It is the idea that we should feel ashamed for being African. But now we know they feared our power, so they buried it. They feared our unity, so they divided us. They feared our brilliance, so they silenced our thinkers. But that silence, it ends here. In this voice, in this generation, in this moment. Africa is not waiting. Africa is not wounded anymore. Africa is wide awake. If this moved, you do not just feel it. Comment New Africa, share it with one soul who still believes we are broken. And remember this, we are not what they wrote, we are what we are writing now. For generations, the world has told Africa that it is poor, that it must be patient, that it must wait for help. But the deeper truth buried beneath economic jargon and diplomatic smiles is that Africa has never been poor. It has been drained of its resources, its voice, its dignity. The story of Africa is not one of scarcity, but of exploitation disguised as assistance. Loans wrapped in chains, aid laced with silence. And for decades, Africa paid quietly, obediently, painfully for a system it did not design and never consented to. The World Bank and the IMF were born in the aftermath of a global war, in rooms where no African voice was present. From the very beginning, the rules of this global financial order were not written with Africa in mind, but rather written to keep Africa compliant. They came wearing suits holding promises of development. But behind those contracts were conditions. Behind those smiles were systems designed to take more than they gave. And for too long, African leaders accepted that deal, perhaps out of hope, perhaps out of necessity. But the result was always the same debt, without dignity, survival, without sovereignty. Today, the consequences of that system are no longer hidden. Children in Burkina Faso still study under leaking roofs, while gold leaves the soil beneath their feet. Hospitals run out of gloves, while governments send millions to banks in Paris and Washington. Cobalt powers smartphones around the world, yet in Congo the health budget is smaller than the cost of a single international conference. This is not a failure of management. It is the success of a system built to exploit. It is not chaos, it is control, and yet something is changing. A soldier in dusty boots stands up and says, "We will not ask for permission to be free." His name is Ibrahim Traoré. He is not backed by banks. He is not propped up by foreign embassies. He is the son of a farmer, a captain of a new generation, a man who carries in his chest the fire of Thomas Sankara. And with that fire, he lights the path for others. He ends foreign military presence. He expels Western media. He plants 20 million trees with his people's bare hands. And he does not wait, he acts. Traoré is not a savior. He is a signal, a mirror reflecting the pain of the past and the potential of the future. He reminds us that sovereignty is not something granted. It is something claimed. That development is not something imported. It is something built from within. His rise is not the story of one man. It is the story of an entire continent remembering its worth. Africa's greatest challenge is not lack of money. It is the belief, engineered, taught, enforced, that it must ask before it acts, that it must beg before it builds, that it must suffer in silence while the rest of the world profits. But the silence is breaking. From the villages of Mali to the markets of Nairobi, from the refugee camps of Sudan to the classrooms of Soweto, a new consciousness is awakening. People are no longer ashamed to say we are not leaving, we are rebuilding. This lesson goes beyond policy. It touches the soul. Because the scam of the century was not just economic. It was emotional. It made Africa doubt itself. It convinced generations to look outward for salvation, to measure success in foreign currency, to speak in borrowed tongues. But now the tide is turning, the narrative is shifting, and the future is being redefined on African terms. The lesson is clear. Africa does not need pity, it needs truth. And truth once spoken becomes power. the power to say no to loans that trap, no to aid that silences, no to systems that pretend to save but quietly steal, the power to build schools that teach in local languages, to support farmers who feed African mouths, not European markets, to invest in industries that create not just extract. Traore teaches us that freedom must not be negotiated. It must be lived. That dignity is not a gift. It is a responsibility. That history does not begin with colonization. It continues with resistance. And that Africa's revival will not be televised from Geneva or Brussels. It will rise from the ground up in every child who learns their true name, in every mother who plants hope in her garden, in every youth who chooses to stay and build. Africa's story is not ending. It is just beginning. And that story will not be written by outsiders. It will be written by Africans, not with rage, but with resolve, not with revenge, but with rebuilding. This is the hour of clarity, the moment of reckoning, the return to wholeness, not because the West allowed it, but because Africans finally believe they deserve it. To every African across the continent and in the diaspora, this is your story too. Whether you stand in Accra or Atlanta, Nairobi, or New York, Soweto, or Paris, you are not a spectator. You are a participant. You are not the aftermath. You are the continuation, and your voice matters, because when you say, "We are enough," the world listens. When you say, "We are not poor," history rewrites itself. This is the heartbeat of New Africa, a continent no longer apologizing, a people no longer waiting, a generation no longer ashamed. The future is not coming, it is already here, and it speaks with the voice of those who were once silenced. So remember this, Africa is not weak, she was wounded, but wounds heal, scars speak, and the truth once awakened will not sleep again. And that truth is louder than any summit speech, deeper than any loan agreement, and more powerful than any foreign endorsement. It pulses through the soil of Burkina Faso, through the cries of mothers who buried children because hospitals had no supplies, and through the chants of students who now demand to learn about their own heroes instead of colonial conquerors. It is the truth that Africa's pain was never the result of incompetence, but of interference. That poverty was not organic, it was engineered. And now the lesson is not simply to expose the lie, but to live the opposite of it, with strength, with pride, and with strategy. This is why Traore matters. Not because he has all the answers, but because he dares to ask the right questions. Who gets to decide our future? Why must we trade freedom for funding? What would happen if Africa said no and meant it? These questions unsettle the powerful because they point toward a shift in global gravity, a future where Africa is not the backdrop of someone else's progress, but the main actor in its own revival. And that revival will not come from charity. It will come from choice. The choice to say, we are not waiting for the West to approve our progress. The choice to fund African-led initiatives, African-taught history, African-grown food, African-owned technology. The choice to see value not in what is extracted from the continent, but in what is built within it. This is the quiet revolution already underway. A revolution of mindset, of memory, of meaning. The lesson is also spiritual. It teaches that shame has no place in the hearts of a people who have endured this much and are still rising. That colonization did not erase identity, it buried it under layers of distortion. But now that identity is returning, in song and language and leadership. And with every step forward, Africa reclaims not just territory, but truth. To every young African wondering if they belong in the global conversation, you do. Not because you imitate the West, but because you carry something the world has long tried to suppress, an unshakable connection to land, to community, to purpose. That is your inheritance. And your resistance is not loud, it is disciplined, it is focused, it is generational. So what do we do with this awakening? We build, we educate, we heal. We tell our stories not through the lens of tragedy, but through the lens of resilience. We remember that aid without autonomy is just a leash. That applause from abroad means nothing if our people still suffer in silence. That real change begins not with permission but with belief. Africa is no longer a question mark, it is an exclamation. A declaration that begins with every farmer who chooses to stay, every teacher who refuses to quit, every artist who paints the truth, and every leader who stands without fear. Because we do not fear failure. We fear forgetting who we are. This is why we must teach our children about Sankara and Lumumba. Why we must reimagine education not as mimicry, but as empowerment. Why we must see technology not as foreign, but as a tool for African solutions to African challenges. The world wants us to believe that we are too divided, too corrupt, too poor. But those are stories they wrote. It is time we write our own. And as we write, we must also unlearn. Unlearn the idea that progress is only valid if validated by the West. Unlearn the myth that foreign is better. Unlearn the belief that dignity is negotiable, because it is not. It never was. If Ibrahim Traoré teaches us anything, it is that leadership is not about titles. It is about truth. And truth does not need translation. It needs courage. He reminds us that we do not rise when others permit us. We rise when we remember ourselves. So let this be the final word in this lesson. Africa is not asking anymore. Africa is answering. With its voice, with its vision, with its victory, and to those who still doubt whether Africa is ready to lead, ready to thrive, ready to stand, look again, because the drums are beating, and Africa is marching forward, not behind, not beneath, but beyond, one waiting. We are done apologizing for our existence, our history, our dreams. We are done asking for a seat at a table that was never built for us. We are building new tables. And at these tables, we speak in our languages. We bring our traditions. We honor our ancestors not with statues, but with service. We measure success not in GDP, but in dignity. Not in how much we export, but in how much we empower. Not in how many foreign investors show up, but in how many local ideas take root. This is not romanticism, it is responsibility. Because with knowledge comes obligation. When you know the truth that the World Bank and IMF were never neutral, that aid has often been a trap, that policies were written not to lift, but to lock, you cannot unknow it. You must act, not just in protest, but in purpose. You must vote with your money, your attention, your labor, your voice. Support the farmer who refuses to sell their land, the doctor who opens a clinic in a forgotten town, the entrepreneur who builds with local materials, the artist who tells our story without distortion. These are not small acts. They are seeds of sovereignty, and like any seed, they require time, protection, and belief. Belief that Africa can lead. That Africans do not need to flee their homeland to find value. That the diaspora is not distant, it is a bridge. That our children deserve more than survival. They deserve truth, and not just historical truth, but emotional truth. The truth that being African is not a burden, it is a blessing. That truth must live in our classrooms, our music, our media. We must flood the world with our voices until no one can deny our worth again, because silence was never our nature, it was forced upon us. And we are now reclaiming what is ours. This reclamation will not be easy. There will be resistance from those outside and within. Some will label it dangerous. Others will call it naive. They will say Africa needs more guidance, more loans, more lectures. But those are the same voices that profited from our confusion. We owe them no explanations, only results. And results will come not just in growth figures, but in restored confidence. In young Africans who say, I will stay and build. In elders who say, I finally see change. In neighbors who share instead of compete. In leaders who serve instead of steal. It begins too in what we stop doing. We stop measuring ourselves against countries that built wealth on our backs. We stop chasing validation from institutions that do not serve us. We stop pretending that foreign experts understand our pain better than we do. And most importantly, we stop waiting, because waiting is no longer an option. Africa has waited through centuries of theft, decades of false promises, and generations of shame, no more. The clock does not belong to colonial time zones anymore. It ticks in African rhythm now, and that rhythm is rising. It rises in every village that plants food instead of importing it, in every community that powers itself with the sun, in every language that is spoken proudly again, in every map that centers Africa, not pushes it to the margins. It rises in every refusal. Refusal to be patronized, refusal to be divided, refusal to be bought. These refusals are acts of resistance, but also acts of creation. They are how a continent becomes whole again. And in becoming whole, Africa redefines what power means. Not the power to conquer, but the power to care. Not domination, but determination. Not control, but connection. Africa's rise does not threaten the world, it teaches it. It reminds the world what resilience looks like, what joy sounds like, what real wealth feels like, not in numbers, but in community. Because in the end, the true measure of Africa's power will not be how much gold it exports. It will be how deeply it believes in itself. And that belief, once planted, cannot be uprooted.